Thought I'd make a quick video on 18 to 135mm lenses, just a general video covering my experience of using one of these lenses for about 4 years period now. So the main attraction with one of these lenses is, apart from the additional range, is that they're not that much bigger than normal lenses. So the kit lens I have on the left here is an 18 to 70 and I have a Tamron 17 to 50 on the right. So apart from when it's extended, the size of the lens isn't really much bigger, but you get that increased range, but of course you do get a bit more in terms of the girth, the size. There might be a bit of weight depending on what you are using. Now at 18mm I put the crop factors in for different APS-C sensors, and we're up to 55mm. This is where you're going to stop with your standard kit lens that you normally get. So when we go up to the 135mm, you'll see we get quite an extra bit of reach with these lenses, and that's one of the appeal points for me when I got the lens. Now I'm going to look at some practical examples now. Here I'm at the 50mm mark, and we're going to move up to 75mm. So this is the point that you're going to be a bit beyond your kit lens, and then 85mm. Now it's fair to say that I could have actually just moved closer with this shot, but as you'll see later on, that's not always possible. So we're up to the 135mm mark now. So this will also give you a bit more compression with the image, with the foreground and background, and the image quality is going to vary. On this lens it's pretty good, but it does start to drop off, even stop down right towards the edges, and you'll find that a common trait amongst these super zoom lenses. This is just a quick comparison showing the difference between the two focal lengths. So it is quite a substantial difference. Now if you try and crop in an image like this from that particular focal length, there's going to be a fairly big hit in terms of the image quality, so that's not really going to be an option if you're making larger prints with the image. It might do for a web size print, that's one possibility. At the time I used the lens was there was a protest going on and I was just around the area, and I found it quite a useful lens for picking out people. This guy was doing a speech on the microphone and they were all quite fired up, didn't really have much room to move, so I couldn't really get much closer. You can see 135mm, get pretty good details on that. Here's another example where I was on a car ferry. This is in the Solent, so obviously I can't move closer to subjects with this. And looking over at the distance there, you see the resolution even at 18mm isn't bad. You probably want to stop the lens down a bit, but when I move up to 135mm it lets me zoom in quite a significant distance. So obviously it's not going to be as long as, say, a 300mm lens, but there is a potential for doing a bit of cropping with the lens if you've got maybe a 16 or 24 megapixel camera. But you can see that there are some distortions on the image, and that's another thing that you're going to have to look out for, is a barrel distortion and pincushion. You'll be able to have seen there that I was adjusting that. Now if you're using the camera JPEGs, they'll be able to correct for that automatically. Stopping the lens down does help a little bit. You can also increase the sharpness. This is going to be common amongst all the different makes. This is just my specific lens, which is the A-mount Sony version. So you will find corner performance drops off on these lenses, and that's going to vary depending on which lens you're looking at. For portraits, it's not an ideal lens, but it works quite well. You can get a decent bit of separation from the background, particularly at the telephoto length. Now, I could have moved in a bit closer to have blurred that out a bit more. For close-up work, reasonably good, not quite as good as a lot of kit lenses, but you can get fairly close. Magnification, check that on the lens. They can vary from about 0.22 up to about 0.3 magnification factor. So the best of them will be able to get close to a kit lens performance. It's just showing you the distortion again. Now on some shots it's going to be more noticeable than others. You'll see the horizon bow out. If you're taking lots of shots with straight lines in, it's something that you'll probably want to use. The telephoto end, the pincushion again, it's not too bad on this lens, but it's going to vary depending on which one you're looking at. This is a shot of a guy that was out kite surfing, and he was quite a distance away, so I had to use a crop on this in the camera, so it cropped the image in a bit, so I lost some of the resolution. But even with this lens I was able to get fairly decent results, nice details, even though it was cropping it down a bit from the original image. It was a teleconverter option in the camera, so obviously a longer lens is going to be better for subjects like this, but the fact that you're at 135mm means you'll be able to get some decent results. Here's another example with the distortion correction, and this will also correct the chromatic aberration and if there's any darkening of the corners. I don't find it too bad on this lens, but some lenses might be a bit more severe. This is another landscape shot that I took. We're not quite at the widest length here, we're at 24mm. But again, landscape photography can work quite well with this lens because you're not always using, believe it or not, the widest angle. So if you want to pick out details in the landscape, I've gone up to 135mm here, and any pin cushion's not really going to be a big issue for shots like this, so I often don't actually use any correction. As far as the details go on this lens, pretty good. It does drop off again towards the edges and in the extreme corners a little bit. Has to be said, on some lenses this is going to be worse than others, and it's also going to depend on the distance that you are to the subject. So don't assume that closer up shots would be as bad as this. They might be slightly worse, or they could be a bit better. Every lens is different. Cropping isn't an option with this, even if you're using it for web, because it's just too far a distance to cover. So really that extra focal length does come in handy, and also candid shots where you don't want to disturb people and you need to get in a bit closer. Here you can see I'm at 85mm. So it works well for people shots as well. Now on to low light, ISO 3200. It's not a fast lens. For this particular shot, f5.6. So indoors it's not your ideal choice. You'd really prefer to use an f2.8 lens, possibly even faster, but you're going to have the noise to deal with. But I could make a print off of this without any trouble, so it won't be a good choice for low light shots if you're doing that regularly, but you will be able to get through, be able to muddle through with it if you don't mind using higher ISO. Also not a bad little lens for doing some shots of pets and animals like that, where you can't get closer. Maybe you're at a zoo or something like that. You just need an extra bit of reach that you just don't get with a kit lens. There are going to be some compromises to accept with a lens of this type, less so than with some of the bigger super zoom ranges, and that's the general idea with this. It covers a very common focal range, so a pretty good lens for travel photography, landscapes, possibly candid shots of people. Not bad for portraits if you don't need a massive amount of background blur. You can always keep the subject a further distance away from the background. It wouldn't be as good for low light work, and you'll probably want a bit more range for telephoto if you're doing a lot of wildlife and nature shots. But if you're happy enough to crop in either in camera or post, then you might be able to get by with the lens. This really comes down to, do you use this focal range frequently? All of these lenses have barrel distortion and pin cushion at varying degrees. Some lenses will have a bit more chromatic aberration, and you will definitely get weaker focal lengths, usually either at the wide end or at the telephoto end. So how bad that is depends on the lens, so do investigate the individual lens reviews for those products, because they'll be able to get a better idea of them. But the focal range it does cover is very useful, and you don't have an awful lot extra to carry around. It's just a touch bigger than the normal lenses that you get. This is a site that I use called Camera Price Buster, and it lists out prices of these lenses, and you'll be able to see the price history as well as various alternatives, such as an older model, like you have several with the Canon mount, so you might be able to save some money on that. And also you can also get a deal with bodies. They sometimes bundle them with bodies. If you look at the Fuji lens, that's the most expensive that I've seen, and I personally wouldn't pay that price for that lens. I think that's too expensive. Unfortunately, the camera industry keeps jacking up the prices of lenses, and camera bodies, they're trying to make more money back because they're selling very little stuff compared to what they were. Even in the late 80s, they were actually selling more cameras and lenses back then, believe it or not. So they're trying to scoop that back by increasing prices. But you've also got the second-hand market to look at as well. So you might be able to find something reasonable at the price point that you've set. If you use Micro Four Thirds, they have Olympus have a super zoom lens for that as well. So here you can see the price history on the lens has been pretty substantial increases, at least in the UK and Europe. If you want to have a look at samples that people have taken, I'll put a link below. Pixel Peeper is a site that I look at. People have taken the images and uploaded them to Flickr, and it shows you the full-size images. Use this in addition to sourcing out online reviews, just give you a good idea of real-world shots that people have taken with the lenses. So if you're going to use this focal length range, I think it's quite useful as a replacement to a kit lens. If you're going to just use this lens, I'd add something like a 30 or a 50mm fast lens to complement it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found that useful.